Hey guys, Grassman here, playing more Minor Gun Builder. Someone in the comments asked if I could make a sort of guide for both expensive and cheap builds of each ship, for people both starting and coming back later in the game if they're, like, I don't know, trying to challenge themselves with the cheap ships, but still being able to make them as good as possible. So, I have, for the first 10 ships in this video, made the best possible and the best cheap possible that I can think of ships for each variant. So we're gonna go through them. I have just for the first 10 now. I'll probably do for the next 10 after, and then probably like 5 and 6 or something. But the last ships are more complicated, so I might not be able to make as many of them. And this is like the only video I've ever done any planning to, so I have actually built the ships ahead of time. So for the first off, for the rider used, it doesn't matter. There's one slot, and you're likely only gonna. I think this is like the tutorial ship. You only have enough money for the one thing anyway. For the proper rider, it also doesn't matter. If you can get an extra, like, bullet shooter or a pierce or something, but you'll probably only have, like, 2 damage things in the first place anyway, but again, there is no really difference. This is the best you want to do, and for a cheaper build, you probably only have the money for 2 damages anyway. So, if you do have less money, just throw in an extra damage one. Transporter, this is the expensive build. You can see we have a double damage here, and that's mainly to allow us to cross. There is also the option of, if you're really late game and you have the hexagons going up here, and you have the plus 10 damage, if you don't know what the hexagons are, don't worry about it. But if you have them up here to plus 10 damage for an empty square, not having this could potentially allow you to add 10 and 10. I don't know if it'll allow 10 each way, or if it'll only allow 10 once. I haven't tried it. I don't have the hexagon yet. But it could potentially be better to not have this one for that extra damage. Other than that, you want 1 extra bullet, 1 damage, 1 pierce, and 1 AoE. Could be either AoE, I don't think it matters that much. And then the cheap version is just this. You split it. If you can't afford one of these, use a 2-way split. If you can't afford one of those, just... Well, if you can't afford one of those, the other option is you run it back and forth like this. No, that'd be worse. Don't do that. I've thought of that already. So it depends. Can you afford a 2-way split? Can you afford a 1-way split? If not, just go with a normal through thing. Just something like this. Just have the AoE or the pierce. But if you can afford a 3, this is a really good one for the 3-on, because it allows you to shoot the 3 bullets. Otherwise, just any normal thing going straight forward, don't bother with turns, there's no room on this one. There's just nowhere you can... There's nowhere in the ship where it's worth... You're unable to gain space, basically. Unless you have, like, these turn things, again, from the hexagons, where the turns add damage, it's not worth doing any sort of turn stuff. But of course, in the expensive version, you might have the hexagons, so the extra turns do still help. Moving on. Rocket. This one literally doesn't matter. I think this is like this is the kind of the best thing. Like 1 damage, 1 extra bullet, 1 pierce, and 1 AoE. You'll find so there's a thing about multiplication where it's more effective than multiplication is more effective on 2 medium numbers than a big and a small number. So if you're multiplying 1 times 4, you get 1 times 4 is 4. But if you multiply 2 by 3, you get 5. A more extreme example would be 20 versus 1 is 20, but 10 versus 10 is 100. So you can really increase numbers by having 2 even things. Another option would be what happens if you go 8 times 8 times 4. 8 times 8 is 64. 64 times 4 is over 200. Almost 250. So if you spread it out, that's the best case. So here, 1 damage, 1 pierce, 1 double shot, and 1 AoE. Imagine you're fighting blocks with only 1 health. Or imagine you're fighting blocks with 2 health. So a block with 1 health, the damage won't matter. But if you're fighting blocks with 2 health, you'll shoot 2 bullets, each that'll pierce 1. So you're breaking 4 straight on. The AoE would allow you to break the ones next to it, and the extra damage allows you to kill the 2 strength blocks. And if it's a 4 health block, you're still one-shotting the block, because you're shooting 2 bullets. So having 1 of each is the best you can do, and you want to start doubling up after that. To a certain extent. Having too many pierce or too many AoE can really hinder you later on, especially with certain levels. Sometimes it's better to have extra damage, and obviously because these are so many weak ships, it's not worth having the times 2 damage on a 30% chance, or whatever it is. It's just not worth having those, because the ships are just so small. It's more, and you're likely only doing 1 damage with the easier builds, it's likely only worth having this. That being said, replace any damage with times 3 if you're doing above a certain amount of damage. So for example, if you're doing 3 damage, then 1/3 chance to double it is like dividing the damage by 3 into 1 and then doubling that. So you're getting 2. So that'd be the same. But if you have 4 damage, it's now slightly better. So if you have more than 3 damage, replace the damage thing with an extra thing. But that would maybe require you to be firing more base damage. So it, in this case, isn't worth it. Well, the cheap version isn't worth it. But here, I've got the +5 damage on base. So for me, it would be worth it to make this an extra 30% chance of double damage. But you've got to figure that out based on your own ship's damage. The things that add damage are here, and the hexagons, and the captains. So, next ship. And rocket doesn't change between expensive and cheap, just try and get the best you can. Alien Seeker, again, it's the same thing, it's got faster fire rate, higher projectile speed, but less space. It's like the same thing as the rocket. Next, the bus. So here's the expensive version. You again use this mainly for the cross, and you also have a fair bit of turning for the extra damage. You've again got the 1, 2, 3, 4 different pieces, and then you have this thing. Again, this thing adds an extra thing you could go through, but if you have above a certain amount of damage, the double damage thing could be worth it. I don't know the exact math on is it better to have this or that. You can experiment for yourself. I don't know how much it's going to matter. Unless you have significantly high damage, it's not really going to matter. And again, taking this out, if you have the empty squares add 10 damage, could also be worth it. Probably would be, again, assuming your base doesn't have that much damage. Because at most it's adding 20. But if your base is naturally firing 40 damage, well, it's getting doubled to 80. And for the cheap version, you want this. Just simple, 1, 2, 3 of the different kinds. Any of these can be replaced with damage. If you prefer the damage in the AoE, do it. Especially if you're fighting harder blocks, maybe that's worth it. I'd probably say damage is superior to AoE. Because you're usually probably trying to beat levels. Unless you are trying to farm, but in which case you could still only farm on a level where you're doing 1 damage. Then you split it if you can, otherwise just turn. Just put it in 2 turns if you can't split, but if you can afford a splitter, then go like this. I am trying to make them as cheap as possible, while also good. As you can see, this is a very complicated, expensive design. It's got one of these. This is a cheaper design. It does still require a 2-way turn, but assuming you can afford that, this is probably the best you can do. I think I could afford a 2-way turn at this point. And of course, there was that ship further back where I was like recommending for the cheap version, the 3-way split. If you can't do that, just use a 2-way split and then do basically the same thing. Because you notice the difference between the transporter and the pirate blade? It's just one longer. So you could do the same thing is it one longer and something? The transporter, pirate blade, it's just one longer. And the difference between the bus is it's the same length, there's the extra shot thing. So the pirate blade is very similar to a couple other things. I missed some. How did I end up on the pirate blade? Wait, I'm talking about the wrong... What was it? How did I end up on the pirate blade? Okay, bus. Sorry. I don't know what that was. Sorry if I just confused you all. I confused myself there. This was the A design. B design, it's just a 2-way split. Yeah, this is right. So it's just a 2-way split. Fighter is the next one. For A, it doesn't change. It's like the same thing. Try and have like... Here, the only exception here is you get like 4 spots to put those things in. It's impossible to do any sort of through-way. So, yeah. But you just get 4 straight things and 4 turns. So it doesn't like matter what you put in them really. Just try and have it like split. Don't have them all extra bullets. So I've got 2 extra bullets, 2 pierce, a damage, and 1 of these. And because of my extra base damage, replacing the damage would be better. So for the expensive one, just replace the damage. Could also be worth it to like take off 1 of the pierce, and if you're doing tons and tons of damage, replace it with another like double damage chance. But it depends on how much damage you're doing, whether or not it's worth having more damage or more other abilities. You could also replace 1 of the pierce with an AoE if you prefer that. It's malleable. These are the last 3. So family cruiser, expensive design is having either this or again the nothing spot. The nothing spot if you've got the hexagon. Otherwise, have the double damage piece. It could also depend on a couple things. For one, if you've got the plus 5 damage for turns, this incorporates a lot of turns, and so it's over here. So you're doing a lot of damage. And I've also got I've got the AOE and the Pierce. You don't need the extra damage for the expensive version. These don't actually add that much damage again unless your base is doing a lot of damage, so it could be worth it. Even for an expensive player, it might still be better worth it to do this. The other one should be better, especially if you have the 5 damage returns. But if you don't have that one, this might still be a better design. And this is really the only other better design. Going down, the difference is if you go down like this, you put 1, 2, 3 turns, you still get the same 3. So you still get the 1, 3 turns. Whoops. 2, 3, 4 spots. You still get 4 spots, but you have the extra turns. So for a cheap player, ignore those extra turns. But for a higher player who has the plus 5 damage on the turns, go for the extra turns. But again, this is probably a better design for the extra turns from the strong player anyway. But for the cheap player, this one's not a good ship for a cheap player because you have to build each one individually. Something you might have noticed on some of the previous ships. This is always at the end, not at the beginning. Because at the beginning, you get to go through 1, 2, 3 straight and 1, 2, 3 straight. And then you have the 2 turns here. But that's the exact same thing as having 1, 2, 3 straight and then doing the turn. So it just halves the amount of resources you have to spend. Because you don't have to do 2 of each of these things, you only have to do 1. But for this one, you have no choice but to do 2 of each. So this one's not a great one for cheap players. And finally, Pirate Blade. No, not quite finally. So for the expensive player, again, do this. Gives you the cross thing. Again, chopping off the cross might be worth it, depending on how much damage you're doing and if you have that thing or not. Honestly, it's probably not worth it, because it would only add 20 damage, and you're probably already doing more than 20 damage from the point where you have that square. But again, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. And for this one, we just have 1, 2, 3, and they're all shooting off. So we have 3 shots. This one, the only difference in a couple other ones is, again, it's longer than 1, and it's got the middle firer. So for the expensive player, it's worth having the 2 of these. For the cheap player, just have 1. If you can't afford 1, use the where is it? Here. Use the 2 splitter. If you can't afford a 3 splitter, which hopefully you can by this point, do this. Have the 1, 2, 3. Again, you could probably replace the AoE with the damage. It's probably more worth it at this point, because, again, if you're trying to farm to go through things, use damage. Otherwise, use the AoE. And the AoE isn't always helpful, too, because if you're hitting, a solo block, the AoE is not contributing anything. And finally, window, another bad one for, again, it doesn't change. I have no B design, meaning it's just the same. I've got damage, pierce, extra bullet, AoE. I've got bounce. I threw on bounce because it doesn't matter. You can throw on anything else on those final bits where the bounce are. It's really not going to, change anything. You could throw on an extra damage. You could throw on this. You could throw on that. You could throw on a speed modifier or, a thing to make them turn left or right, whatever you want. This is, again, a bad one for cheap players and bad one for expensive players. Because expensive players, it gives no, variance. All you can do is this, really. And, for the cheap player, it's, again, you have to double everything up. So Windows is a bad ship overall. But those are the first 10 ships, both cheap and expensive designs. I'll probably do the next 10. Thing is, some of these get kind of complicated. You see, this is already quite big. I've never even built the practice launcher. So some of these are starting to get complicated. So I don't know if it's going to be 3 or 4 or 5 more videos in the series. There's 31 ships in total. Getting the first 10 done at once was easy enough. The next ones I might do 5 at a time. Because the next ones are bigger and more complicated. So, I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember, if you enjoyed my content, feel free to like and subscribe. I'll put it back to my normal ship. And I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.